Hi friends, this is Victoria Bowler, and today we are talking about an approach to teaching and learning called Universal Design for Learning. Elementary music teachers see hundreds of students a week, and sometimes hundreds of students a day. And within that student population, there are some pretty dramatic differences in how students learn and how they're going to be the most successful musicians they can be in our classrooms. All of our learners have learning differences because all of our learners are unique, individual musicians with distinct backgrounds and preferences and thoughts and learning strengths and learning challenges. So how can we set up our classroom learning environments to be as accessible as possible to as many students as possible? Universal Design for Learning is an approach that more and more educators are turning to in order to serve their students better. In this video, we will look at who we teach, we will look at why Universal Design for Learning is necessary in elementary general music, and then we're going to look at the core principles of this approach to teaching and learning. When we talk about variability, we are talking about the collection of factors that make students unique from each other. And some of these we are used to thinking about already. So things like student backgrounds, student age, their musical preferences, their skill development, and their social interactions, all of these things. These are just a few of the variables that educators are used to considering on a daily basis. But there are other types of variables that we might not be used to considering when we think about our students. Brain researchers have looked deeper into three important brain networks and how they have a direct impact on our students' learning experiences. One particular model of how the brain works can be helpful when we are demonstrating the variability that all of our learners have. Our brains are made of complex networks, and variability in any of these areas can have a really big impact on how students engage in our music rooms. In this model of brain research, there are three basic network areas that impact learning. The first is the affective. These are the networks that impact how motivated and engaged we are in a particular task. Next are the recognition networks. These networks take in information and then they turn that information into knowledge. And then last, we have the strategic networks. These networks are responsible for planning and organizing intentional action. When we align our teaching to each of these brain networks, we have students who have the opportunity to be motivated and engaged, that's the affective network, who understand musical ideas, recognition, and then they can put that knowledge into action over time, strategic network. Now, these areas of the brain are not static. They are variable, and they're based on the individual and the individual over time, and then the learning environment that that individual is in. So in any one class of learners, we are working with 25 or so really complex humans with complex brain networks that change and adapt to the learning situation. With this understanding of variability, we can easily see the problem with grouping students into general categories of good at music or not talented, or a good student or a behavior problem, or a normal student and a disabled student, because each of us has a really wide range of variables that are constantly in motion. Each of us has strengths and challenges to learning. So here's the takeaway. There is no single profile of an average elementary musician. All elementary musicians have learning differences. So instead of trying to make all students learn in the same way at the same pace, what if we made our classrooms as accessible as possible for all learners? Universal Design for Learning poses an interesting question for us to consider. Instead of looking at our students as having a deficit, what if we wondered how our curricula and the learning context could be disabling? If a student is unsuccessful, what if our first step were not to look at that individual student and think about what they need to change in order to reach the demands of our curriculum? What if instead we first looked around the student at the larger context? So our demeanor as teachers, the environment for learning, our curriculum, our expectations. And what if we were to think about how the curriculum and the context could be adapted so the student is really set up to be successful? Now, really quickly, this does not mean that we are taking away accountability on the part of the student. In fact, it's just the opposite. This means that we view ourselves as partnering with students to help them be more successful and take charge of their own learning. So, what makes it universal? Universal design for learning is not meant to be implemented for the sake of one single student population or one type of learning approach. When we design our teaching practices to engage more learners more deeply, everyone benefits. And this is the universal part of universal design. This approach is not exclusively for students with IEPs or self-contained music classes or students formally diagnosed with a learning disability. This philosophy has its roots in physical design for buildings, and so that makes a good starting point to illustrate this principle. Many buildings have automatic doors, right? And so if a person with a wheelchair wants to enter a building, the automatic doors make it way more convenient, and that's a really good thing. But automatic doors are not exclusively for people who move in a wheelchair. They are a feature that benefit caregivers who are trying to move in and out of the building, maybe while carrying young children. They are for people who are leaving business meetings with their hands full of papers and memos. They're for people who are leaving the store with a shopping cart that's full of groceries. And so a person who moves in a wheelchair can really benefit from an automatic door, and that is a really good thing. But we don't put the automatic doors on the side entrance of a building with the sign that says modified door for wheelchair use, because those doors are not only for a person who uses a wheelchair. It's an accommodation that is universally more inclusive. In the classroom, universal design for learning is not for one specific student population. All students benefit when we make our learning environment more accessible. So what if, instead of writing the same lesson segment on half notes that we always teach and then going back to retrofit it for specific students, what if we began the learning process by thinking of ways to make learning experiences more accessible for all of our students? What if we began planning learning experiences by looking at variables first, instead of retroactively thinking of disabilities? So here's the takeaway question. How can our classrooms and our teaching practices reach as many students as possible with as much of an impact as possible? That's what we're going to answer with these 3 pillars of universal design for learning. The developers of this approach synthesized findings in fields of brain research and education and child development to come up with these 3 basic pillars of universal design for learning. The first is multiple means of engagement. So why should students be engaged in the material that we teach? This pillar deals with the affective networks with the brain, which impact how motivated and engaged we are in a particular task. So in music, we can offer lots of opportunities for students to be interested in what we teach. This is one of the reasons that elementary music teachers use multiple media, like singing and speaking and playing and moving. And we also use different skills, like improvising and arranging and listening and reading and writing and all of those things. We also use different artistic processes, creating, performing, responding, and connecting. When we use multiple means of engagement, we are providing students lots of different pathways to be engaged and motivated to take part in our material. Next is multiple means of representation. This is the what about learning. What exactly are students engaging with in our lesson? This pillar deals with the recognition networks of the brain, and those are the ones that take in information and then turn it into knowledge. We can offer students lots of different opportunities to interact with information in the classrooms. So instead of just asking students to memorize the shapes of musical notation symbols, we can lead them on a student-centered and discovery-based sequence of learning, where we explore many different musical pathways to represent a sound. So this could be tactile experiences like singing games or movement. It could be listening experiences. It could be things like graphic notation that students generate, things like that. We can think beyond just insisting that students read standard Western visual notation. Next, multiple means of action and expression. This is the how. How are students going to show what they know? This pillar deals with the strategic networks of our brains, and those are the ones responsible for planning and organizing intentional And we can offer lots of different opportunities for students to showcase their learning. This is one of the other reasons that choices in musical media, singing, speaking, playing, and moving, are so important. This is also another reason that we scaffold musical concepts in an intentional progression so that students can create musical responses lots of times throughout the learning process. And then when we partner with students to focus on this strategic part of the brain, they are also encouraged to use executive function, and those things manage impulse control. So in this video, we've talked about a lot of different pieces for universal design for learning. And when we come across a new framework for education, it can be kind of intimidating to think through how exactly we should start taking this big idea philosophy and implementing it into really practical, actionable steps. So we're going to start with a really basic universal design for learning audit. And with this audit, we want to answer the question, could universal design for learning be useful in your music room? So the next time you teach students, whatever that lesson structure looks like, virtual, hybrid, in person, let's look at how many variables you notice in your classroom. So which students seem to be motivated? Which students seem to recall information from last class? And then do you notice some students showing self-control or some students showing more of a lack of self-control? So in other words, we are going to begin by looking at one of the things that we talked about at the very top of the video. We are going to begin by looking at who we teach. In the next video, we will look at some ways to offer more means of engagement so students have the opportunity to be more interested and motivated in the music room. If you have thoughts about the principles of universal design for learning, I would love to hear from you. You can drop a comment below. You can find me on Instagram. I am at Victoria Bowler, or you can shoot me an email, victoria@victoriabowler.com. Thank you so much for watching, and happy teaching.